Welcome to Business Line's State of the Economy podcast, where you'll find insight, analysis, and the story behind the numbers.
Hello and welcome to the State of the Economy podcast. I'm Jyothi Datta. So clinical trials involve the testing of medicines on humans, and to ensure that they are safe and effective in treating the illness they are designed to treat. In India, the clinical trial rules of 2019 were a recent significant milestone, but then came the COVID-19 pandemic. So how has this segment recovered since, and how has it been faring? Well, to answer that, we have with us Dr. Sanish Davis, President of the Indian Society for Clinical Research. Thank you, Dr. Davis, for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So during COVID, we did see much work on vaccines and medicines, and that discussion still continues. But for the clinical trial industry, has it recovered from the pandemic effect, and how is it doing in India now? I mean, are pharma companies undertaking many more trials?
Yes, so very positive news to start off the conversation. If you look at the number of studies that were done prior to the pandemic and the number of studies that are being done currently, there's definitely an uptick in the number of studies. But many of these studies are mainly in the unmet areas of oncology, that is cancers, immunology, which involves anything from bowel disorders like ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, dermatological conditions which have an immunological basis, like, for example, systemic lupus erythematosus or SLE, as we say, Sjogren's disease and others. And then there is also a lot of interest in doing studies in rare diseases, which, as all of us would appreciate, is an area where there are very few studies that are done in India. Now there is much more interest in doing the studies, and obviously because India is also, you could say, doing a lot of work, even at the government level, in some of our academic institutions, etc., on rare diseases, etc. So overall, apart from all the other existing therapeutic areas like cardiovascular diseases, respiratory diseases, infections, etc., we are also seeing more cutting-edge work come to India in oncology, immunology, etc., which are areas where there are a lot of research happening globally also.
Right. So we're seeing from our last conversation, you were saying something like 160, 170 trials, is it?
Yeah. So those numbers would continue to fluctuate year on year. But roughly, I think those would be the numbers that are seen. Now, for listeners who must be thinking these are numbers which are not, you could say, a significant leap from where we were maybe 10, 12 years back when India was doing 450 to 500 clinical trials. The reality is that the companies who are doing studies in India are very sure that these products will be marketed in India. And that could be one reason why year on year, even after the post-COVID period, we are seeing almost a steady number of studies being done. And in the coming years also, what you would see is that base upon which you will see increasing number of studies.
Right, absolutely. You've jumped right into it. I was just going to make that comparison with where we were as a country years ago. But for someone who may not understand, why clinical trials are important and what are the benefits that could come from doing a trial in a country, if you could explain that.
Yeah. So clinical trials, as everyone would have, you could say, understood from the COVID period, where vaccines were tested, drugs were tested to find out if they were beneficial to the human health. Very clearly, any drug which has to be launched or rather has to be marketed or has to be consumed by patients has to be tested. Now, that testing happens in two different areas. One, the testing can be in the labs and in the animal models which mimic the human disease condition. And once you find out that they are safe and they are efficacious, then the drug moves into human testing. So already a lot of safety, toxicity, and all those concerns are already addressed in the lab, plus the preclinical, as they say, the animal testing that happens. When it comes into the humans, there are like different phases of testing, right? From phase 1, where the drug is initially given to human beings at a dose which is very less and which is expected to provide good safety margins as well as efficacy. The drug is tested in human healthy volunteers in all conditions except for maybe oncology or cancer conditions, anyone in rare disease, etc. And then it moves into phase 2, where a larger sample of patients are tested, then into phase 3, and then the drug gets marketed or is ready for, you could say, use by humans with the disease. Now, without clinical trials, there's no way that you can say that a drug is actually efficacious and safe for consumption by human beings. And that is also very important for drugs which can have a benefit risk ratio which may not be significantly high. And the example for that is maybe let's look at the disease condition called as, you could say, cancers. Now, like everyone knows, for many of the cancers, the drugs also have safety effects, right? And the safety effects can be in the form of, you could say, decrease in the immunity of the patient. It could be in the form of hair loss, or it could be in the form of skin problems, etc. So that is the side effects of the drug. Now, when compared to that, the cancer treatment also affects the cancerous cells. Now, those cancerous cells actually, when they actually get, you could say, bombarded with the drug, it kind of like dies. Now, that could also be beneficial, and that could also provide some form of safety issues, because when large volume of cancer cells actually die, that could also lead to some small side effects that are produced in the humans. Now, if you have to know about all this, the ideal situation would be to kind of like study the drug for several years and then say that, okay, it is ready to be launched and used by patients. But you don't have that luxury where you can study patients for a large period of time, because everyone wants the drug as early as possible for their unmet medical need. So you have clinical trials, which is like a controlled experiment, where within a period of 6 months to 1 year, you try to find out whether the drug can potentially have beneficial effects or less safety issues that are possible. And then with that data, you actually are able to market the drug, or it will be taken by patients. All throughout the use of the drug, there is safety monitoring that continues to happen, which is called as post-marketing safety, you could say, studies that are done, or surveillance that is done. And ultimately, after several years, when there is large number of patients who are using the drug, you, as a doctor who's treating these patients, you get to know that, okay, that this drug is definitely having a much better beneficial effect than the safety issues that can be done. So that's the whole objective of the clinical trial. Now, clinical trials, especially in conditions like oncology or cancers, can also be looked at as a care option. Like, for example, in the Western world, just like patients are started with a first-line drug, when they actually don't produce benefits to that first line, then they are added to another drug, which is called as a second line, and then so on. But in every cancer treatment, there is also an option to access a clinical trial with a new class of drug or a different class of drug, which can be beneficial in the patient. Now, this is a standard algorithm which is followed in many of the Western countries, like in the US or Europe and Japan, etc. Now, in India, we don't have a care option where clinical trials are offered in all the centers. There are some centers where clinical trial definitely becomes, you could say, an option. But we want, especially from the Indian Society for Clinical Research and many of the other stakeholders, we want this care option to be given to the patient so that more number of clinical trials come to India and patients have a better opportunity to participate in these clinical trials.
Right, very clearly explained there. So the closer the trial is to the patient, the greater the the access to the new drug that is being brought in. So recently, Doc, the Drug Regulatory Authority had come out with guidelines to bring in sort of clarity, I suppose, into all of this. So could you just explain what really these guidelines are about?
So the regulations that came out in 2019 is called as the New Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules. Now, this actually brings in all the different facets of what should be the roles and responsibilities of all the stakeholders in clinical trials. And by stakeholders, I mean the patient, the investigator who's doing the clinical trial in a hospital, the sponsor, which could be either pharmaceutical companies or it could be clinical research organization or sometimes even academic institutions themselves, and the ethics committees who are the guardians of, you could say, ensuring that the safety of the patient in the clinical trial is assured. Now, earlier also there were regulations about all these, you could say, roles and responsibilities. But this regulation, the NDCTR, as we say, brought out much greater clarity on the roles and responsibilities of each stakeholder who's doing a clinical trial or who's doing a particular activity in a clinical trial. The regulations also have the other facets of how the clinical trial engine runs, in the form of how is the drug to be, you could say, be manufactured, how can it be transported from the site of manufacturing to the hospital where the clinical trial is doing, how it should be stored, how it should be destroyed or how it should be retained, etc. So all those details about the investigational medicinal product or in the investigational drug, as we say. And then it also contains all the forms and other requirements that are there for applying for approvals for doing the clinical trial. And of course, what should be there in the protocol for the study that is being done. What should be there in the different formats of the informed consent form that is used in the study, etc. So overall, it gives much better clarity for several activities which were, you could say, be done in India prior to 2019, which were put in the form of different, you could say, smaller regulations that used to come every 1 to 2 years, etc. So this regulatory document called as the NDCTR has now a comprehensive approach to all the different activities, as well as the processes, as well as the application forms, etc., that are needed for the clinical trial. Now, when you look at global clinical trials, which are these large studies which are done across the world, like, for example, if a drug is discovered in, say, the United States or in the UK or in Japan or some other European countries, then it has to undergo all the clinical trials, right? And the multi-centric or the multinational clinical trials, or even drugs which are discovered in India, they have to be run through clinical trials that are there. Now, all those different facets of how it can be done are all covered under the New Drugs and Clinical Trial Rules.
Right. So that brings in also aspects, as you pointed, about manufacturing, storage, quality, and all of that. How does India stack up against other countries in terms of the regulatory timelines for clinical trials? I mean, we've covered much ground. I know from the 2013s, when there was this whole issue around the trials. But as you pointed out, there's been clarity in terms of the regulations and in terms of the way the industry operates. So how does India actually stack up in terms of the regulatory timelines?
So if you look at, you could say, an independent third party which actually evaluates all the different countries where clinical trials are being done and the timelines for regulatory approval, from the period from 2017 until 2020, which is like the COVID period or just pre-COVID and this thing, India's regulatory timeline was almost similar to maybe some of the countries which were doing large volume clinical trial, like around 3 months to 4 months of approval timeline. Post 2020, everyone expected that momentum will continue. But what we are seeing is that there is a slight increase in timeline again. We till I think the 2023 or towards the later part of 2023, where the timeline kind of like became around close to around 4.5 to 5 months for getting approval. We are again seeing that the regulatory agency has stepped up to its task, and we are now again seeing that the regulatory approvals are coming through in 3 months. Now, these are, when you look at the global list of countries that are doing studies, you could have countries like the US where approvals come within 1 month. Even in our neighboring region, Malaysia, Korea, etc., have regulatory approvals for protocols which come in 1 to 1.5 to maybe 2 months. So our stated timeline for regulatory approval is 90 working days, which if you put it in the calendar timeline, it is around 4.5 months. Now, when you look at 90 working days, it's like a good timeline. But when you actually put it, you could say from the start to the end, actually it takes around 4.5 months for us to get approvals. Now, of course, we are seeing a lot more, you could say, faster activity on that. But this does not put us in, you could say, in great shape when compared to the other global countries where large volume studies are done. We need to have regulatory approvals come in at least within 45 days or 1.5 to 2 months maximum. And I'm talking about calendar days rather than working days, right? And then you will be competitive, and then I think we'll have more studies which can happen. Let us not look at only studies which are coming from outside of India. Even for studies which are of companies who are actually doing research and development in India, who are doing innovative medicines in India, they would rather go out of the country to do their clinical trials because time is money, right? Time is a big factor in drug development. And if India takes 4.5 months to give you an approval, and then it takes another couple of weeks or even a month to actually start the study, you can actually get your study done in that time period in a location like in the European Union or in the US or even in Australia, where these timelines are close to actually 1 month of approval, right? So that is where I think our needle has to shift if we have to become competitive. And becoming competitive means that more number of clinical trials will happen in India. Indian companies itself will do clinical trials in India rather than having to look outside, which means that there is also expertise which will be built up in India. There will also be a revenue saving for these companies because they can do these studies in India rather than having to do this in expensive, you could say, locations like the US, etc. Of course, there are tax breaks in some of these countries, but even then, if you are able to do these studies in India at the speed that you would get in a Western country, that is a huge cost, time saving, etc. That can happen for Indian R&D companies.
Closer home also there's competition, isn't there? Like Malaysia and possibly Singapore?
Correct. Yeah. So Malaysia, the government is very much invested in clinical trials. They have something like a network of hospitals that they have designated as clinical trial centers, which have support from the government. Also, a lot of training and others also go into it. They've also roped in pharmaceutical companies to actually partner with the government so that training, getting sites up to speed, bringing in phase 1 programs, etc., so that there is capacity as well as capability building for investigators and sites. So all this has a huge government investment in time, resources, and money that is there. So their regulatory agency gives approvals within 1 month, which makes Malaysia a very attractive destination for global clinical trials because you can open your study within maximum 2 months in the country, whereas when India sometimes get unfairly compared for our timelines, which might be around 4 to 5 months or sometimes even 6 months for starting our studies.
Right. So that's on regulatory timelines. Now we're also, we're seeing treatments come more from the biologic space and other newer therapies. So how is both the regulatory framework and, as you point out, the healthcare ecosystem or infrastructure prepared to deal with this?
Yeah, so for some of the biological agents, especially for stem cells or rDNA and all that, the newer you could say, therapeutic modalities which are coming in. The Indian, we still don't have a single window system, right? While the government is very keen to actually implement the single window system, and they have been able to do it in many areas, this is one area where they are, you could say, still to kind of like get all these different agencies which give approval onto a single, you could say, nodal point. And that becomes like, you could say, one body which gives approval for all the different, you could say, part of the approval process. So we have Department of Biotechnology, we have, you could say, GESA or Genetic Engineering, you could say, committee. You have the Health Ministry Screening Committee. So you have all these different committees which need to kind of like come to meet. They sometimes don't talk to each other. So there is back and forth that happens. So precious time actually gets lost in all these different ones. Recently, the ministry actually brought out, you could say, a change in how this is going to happen with a single independent ethics committee, which actually at the institution level can give approval. And then there is the regulatory approval, or the, you could say, the DBT approval that comes to, and then you can start the study. But we need to see how that functions in order to actually put more confidence in the way that it happens. So the regulations needs to move into a single window system for India to actually catch up with some of its peers in order to actually do biological studies at a faster pace. And many of the Indian companies who have actually been only doing generic, you could say, development and others, are investing more and more into research and development for biologicals, stem cells, rDNA vaccines, and others in India as we speak, which means that we need to actually have, you could say, regulations which will support their development. Even if it is a startup organization, etc., we need regulations which actually can work for these innovations when they come out. So that's the first thing. Second is, of course, we need ethics committees and institutions where researchers have these kind of experiences, so that it doesn't become, you could say, a big challenge for companies to actually come and do these, you could say, state-of-the-art biological and other programs in India. So that experience will not come overnight. For that, you need to have, you could say, smaller studies being placed, and then you could say more experience being built up. And there has to also be investment from the government in setting up these centers. This year, I think ICMR has taken a big step in actually setting up clinical trial centers of excellence for phase 1 studies in some of the key institutions. Now, that is going to be a big catalyst for a lot of other sponsors also to come and utilize those things. Because obviously, initially, I think sponsors will be hesitant to actually place studies in these centers because you don't have past experience and others with these centers. But once smaller academic studies with biologicals and others, vaccines and etc. happen, the sites will gain confidence. They will get inspected, audited, etc. And the overall expertise actually improves. And that will open the door for more such studies to actually come in. The third part of it is, of course, the general public, right? The lay person. The lay person also needs to be educated or sensitized more about the importance of clinical trials. While the Indian Society of Clinical Research does its bit, I think through the media, through, you could say, the hospitals, there has to be more information about clinical trials which go to the lay person, because that's the only way that they will be able to gain confidence and, you could say, be participants in the overall clinical trial experience.
Right, absolutely. So, you did point out to how trials would bring newer drugs closer to patients and faster. Now, just one final question, really, in terms of what happens in the event of something not going as per planned, whether it's in the trial or subsequently when it's marketed, in terms of compensation. What sort of a recourse do people who participate in trials or thereafter have? What do the rules lay out there?
Yeah, so India, in a way, made, you could say, a change in her destiny with changes to how clinical trial participants will be looked at. So the big change that happened in India is bringing in two things. One is medical management of patients who actually have a clinical trial injury when they are a participant. And second is compensation to be provided to the next of kin in case of death happening while the participant is in a clinical trial, or if they have permanent injuries or disabilities as part of participating in a clinical trial. Now, India is probably the only unique country in the world where this kind of clinical trial safety net is there. While in a standard clinical trial, there is always the clinical trial insurance that the sponsor provides, which covers for, you could say, anything that happens in a clinical trial to the participant. But those, you could say, insurance is in a way on top of the standard insurance that the patient has as part of his healthcare package. Like, for example, if you're doing a clinical trial in the US, the patient already has a healthcare plan or an insurance that they can use even while they are a participant in a clinical trial. So many of their standard of care drugs get reimbursed. Even if they have, you could say, a safety issue in a clinical trial, they get care if the clinical trial insurance is not taking care of that requirement. But in India, we know that majority of our patients are, could say, accessing healthcare as out of pocket or pay from pocket, you could say, expenditure. And only 10 to 12% or maybe a little bit more than that would have an insurance coverage. Now, when patients actually who pay from their pocket are part of clinical trial, the clinical trial insurance will cover what is there in the clinical trial, but it will not cover things which are outside of the clinical trial insurance, you could say, underwritten as per the clinical trial. That is where in India, the benefits of medical management being free for the patient if they have a clinical trial injury, and compensation, which is calculated based on, you could say, the patient's, you could say, their income and others based on very clear set of guidelines or formulas come into a picture. And that is why I think the safety nets in India for clinical trial participants are much better than I would say in some of the more developed countries where some of the patients may not have this level of protection that is there.
Right. That is as far as the trial is concerned. But when it goes into post-marketing surveillance and all of that, Doc, how does that get covered?
Yeah. So outside of a clinical trial, say for example, a patient who's taking a marketed drug. If the patient has a serious adverse event or adverse drug reaction, etc., then the reporting and other things actually follows as per the standard, because the side effects or the adverse effects of the drug are, you could say, known to a much greater effect when the drug is in the market. And it's a joint decision between the doctor and the patient who's taking treatment from the doctor that the prescribed drug would have these benefits and a potential these adverse event as per the label of the product or the prescribing information of the product. So when that happens, when a patient has an adverse event, the patient has to have the opportunity to, of course, report that adverse effect to the doctor who's treating the patient. And that data gets pulled up from individual doctors all the way into, you could say, centers, pharmacovigilance centers, etc. And then it goes to the national level. We have the National Pharmacovigilance Program, which takes care of it. And then based on all the data which comes to them, they will be able to kind of like find if there are any trends in the marketed drugs, whether it is producing anything new, which is not already known from the clinical trial. They can then provide dear doctor letters, which are like letters which are written to the doctor, highlighting some of the safety issues that might be seen once the drug has been marketed. It can also enlighten the public on, you could say, what could happen if, you could say, a drug has any safety issue which may not have been there, which have been earlier identified. So that's the entire process which is followed in the drugs which are post-marketed.
Right. All of clinical trials and thereafter, this is a never-ending subject. So we'll come back to you again at some other point, maybe for a longer discussion. But with that, we'll bring this conversation to an end, Doctor. From the Business Line team and myself, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.